Yeah, I agree. I agree. I think we're having, yes, 30 people. It was not, it was a direct message. So, welcome everyone. This is a public public talk organized by the Real Project, uh, also known as Post Growth Deal Project, a project run at as a collaboration between two parts of its teams at the Autonomous University of Barcelona and University of Lausanne. And today we will listen to about work done by two of the researchers of our project. One by Dylan and Leah, and they're going to present the paper that's called the ecological efficiency of human development in 20th century socialist and capitalist economies. And let me just briefly present Dylan and Leah. Um, Dylan Sullivan is a doctoral researcher, um, indeed, at two universities at UAB in Barcelona and Macquarie University in Sydney. He also teaches political science, sociology, and anthropology at Macquarie University. Published in journals such as World Development, New Political Economy, and World Development Perspectives. And his research focuses on political economy, global inequality, poverty measurement, and the economics of socialist planning. Lea Tamberg is a PhD researcher at the University of Lausanne. She researches the socioeconomic and biophysical prerequisites of human well-being, both conceptually and empirically. She holds a bachelor's degree in applied system science from the University of Osnabrück and a master's degree in data science from ETH Zurich. So, a few more important things. First, the meeting will be recorded, so it is already recorded, just so everyone knows. Second, it will be then uploaded on ICTA YouTube, which is ICTA YouTube channel, which is a link to which I'm sharing right now. And next, what else is left? Yeah, and then the next talk in this public series of talks is going to happen on 27th of May. It will be with Morena Henbury Lamas and I'm missing. Sorry, I don't have the title at my fingertips. I'm sorry. I'll speak about this in the end of the meeting. So I think I'll give the floor to Dylan, who will present. And as far as I understand the plan, Leah is here also to answer questions on their co-authored work. So please, Dylan.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sergey, for the introduction. How's my microphone, everyone? Can people hear? It's always a little bit disconcerting speaking at a purely online event. I don't know, I find it sort of slightly surreal not having a real audience, but thank you that a lot of you have put your cameras on. That is nice. Creates the illusion of actually being in the same room as people. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. I've just sent a request. Okay, share. How is that? Can everyone see my slides? Okay, excellent. So, as Sergey has already said, the topic of this talk, and this is based on a manuscript that Leah and I recently submitted. The topic of this talk is the ecological efficiency of human development in 20th century socialist and capitalist economies. And it might be somewhat helpful if I sort of start by explaining how we came to look at this topic and sort of what we mean by these concepts. So, as I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware, we are currently living in an ecological crisis. We are seeing runaway climate change caused by excess emissions, primarily from a handful of rich countries. And many scientists are beginning to say that we're living through the sixth mass extinction. as we smash through multiple planetary boundaries. Yet at the same time, we are also facing a social crisis where, according to some estimates, perhaps over 80% of the world's population is still denied access to goods and services that are required for decent living. And so I think in this context, the great challenge of the 21st century is how do we create an economy that meets the needs of everyone at ecologically sustainable levels of production and resource use. And the sort of bad news coming out of existing research is that no countries currently achieve this objective. So we have a group of countries in the world that achieve relatively good social outcomes, still not perfect, but relatively good, yet they have very high levels of resource use and consumption, ecologically unsustainable levels of resource use and consumption. These countries primarily being in Western Europe and the Western European settler colonies. On the other hand, we have a large number of countries that have low or modest levels of resource use and production, and yet these countries with some important exceptions, fail to meet human needs at a reasonable standard. Now, the reason that this problem occurs, I think, is that our economies are organized around economic growth and elite accumulation. And so I think there's an emerging consensus in ecological economics that the way to achieve strong human welfare outcomes within ecological limits is by implementing public planning policies that can allow us to reorient our economies towards meeting human needs. So policies like a public jobs guarantee, universal access to social services, decommodifying food systems and healthcare systems and housing. And in this context, there's also been, I think, a renewed focus on socialist policy and the potential power of socialist policy in meeting human needs within planetary boundaries. So to summarize this, yeah, Sergey.
You're not trying to. You don't have a new slide now, right? You're just speaking, introducing the topic. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm just introducing the topic. That's right.
Okay, just so everyone, because people are nervous.
Thank you for checking in. So to summarize this, I think we can say that there's this potential for public planning policies, for socialist policy, to make our economies more ecologically efficient in terms of human development, to get higher human development outcomes, better human development outcomes, and more ecologically sustainable levels of production. And we refer to this as ecological efficiency of human development. So we wanted to test this question empirically by looking at, and now I will switch my slides, by looking at the experience of 20th century socialist states. Because although there's been this renewed focus on the potential power of public policy to achieve strong human welfare outcomes and to make our economies more ecologically efficient, there's been very little research on the actual experience of the socialist states that existed in the 20th century. And so we wanted to test this empirically. I mean, in the 20th century, about a third of the world's population lived in governments, lived in states where the government was declared itself to be trying to achieve the development of socialist public provisioning systems. And yet we know very little about how this actually played out in terms of human welfare. So I'll briefly run through the methods we used when approaching this question. So we started by dividing the world into 4 geopolitical regions, which you can see on this graph here. So on the one hand, we've divided the world into socialist and capitalist states. This is based on the United Nations categorization of countries during the Cold War. So the United Nations categorized countries into planned economies, what we call socialist economies, and market economies, what we call capitalist economies. We have also drawn a division here, and as I've already said, these socialist states were officially and publicly declaring themselves to be in the process of creating public provisioning systems that would orient the economy towards human development and towards social goals. We've also divided the world between a core group of states and a periphery group of states. So world systems theorists point out that the world economy is structured in such a way that core states benefit from a historical and ongoing imperial relationship with peripheral states. And so we divided the world between periphery and core using a country classification system developed by Christopher Chase Dunn, who is an economic and social historian of the world economy. In Christopher Chase Dunn's categorization, all of the socialist states are considered periphery, but the capitalist states are divided between this capitalist core and capitalist periphery, which you can see on this map. And then we also tease out a fourth group, which is called the revolutionary states, or what Cerecetto and Waitzkin call the recent post-revolutionary state. These countries are in yellow here. And these states experienced socialist revolution after 1970 or after the late 1960s. And the reason for treating them as a separate group is essentially, as Cerecetto and Waitzkin point out, because their socialist revolutions happened too late for governments to actually be able to have enough time to implement socialist policies and to allow those policies to have a direct impact on human welfare standards in the population. And in fact, all of these states just about were subject to massive imperialist attack by the United States and its allies. So in Nicaragua, the Sandinista government was attacked by the United States. The United States backed the Contra terrorist groups that went around from village to village, slaughtering peasants who were engaged in who were supporting the Sandinista government. In Mozambique and Angola, apartheid South Africa, with US support, sent in proxy forces that murdered and terrorized the rural population. And these imperialist attacks, we can go through the list, but these imperialist attacks prevented these governments from properly implementing or successfully achieving socialist development objectives. So these are our four country categories. And our focus is primarily on a comparison between the socialist states and the capitalist periphery. Now, the reason for that is because I think if we're talking about 20th century socialism as a historical process, I mean, it's important to stress here, we're not looking at socialism in some abstract sense. We're looking at socialism in a historically specific sense to refer to these states that arose in the 20th century. And their objective, their historical role, if you will, very much was combating the conditions of peripheralization that these states had been subject to previously. And so in that sense, I think the correct comparison is between the capitalist periphery and the socialist states. The capitalist core has this imperial privilege, and as a result of this, we can talk about this more in the discussion, as a result of the capitalist core's imperial privilege, it is able to achieve very high human development outcomes. And it also has very high levels of resource use in a way that actually isn't, this is a development pathway that isn't open to states in the periphery. So for these groups, we look at 19 indicators of human development, and I'm going to go through these in a moment. And then we regress these 19 human development indicators on to indicators of production and resource use. And we run 3 different analyses, each with a different production-based indicator. So GDP, material footprint, and CO2 emissions. I'll talk more about what those sort of refer to in a moment. And finally, we focus on the year, for the most part, we focus on the year 1980. 1980 is our preferred year for the analysis. And that's because most socialist states had been around for about 30 years, which is arguably enough time for socialist policy to have an impact on the economy and the population. In some cases, we use the year 1990, but we feel that the year 1990 is a second best option. In some cases, data constraints in the data force us to use 1990, but a lot of socialist countries had already begun to pursue capitalist reforms during the 1980s, which makes the year 1990 less useful. China is an obvious example here of a country that pursued reforms throughout the 1980s, but also Poland, for instance, and Hungary were under, and Yugoslavia were under IMF and World Bank structural adjustment programs in the 1980s. We'll talk about this more in the discussion. So those are our methods, and let's have a look at the results. So the first analysis, we regress the social indicators on GDP per capita. Now, this graph is a little bit complicated, but let me sort of talk you through it. So each of the panels on this graph show a different social indicator regressed onto GDP per capita. So the y-axis of the graphs, the y-axis of the panels, represents a different social indicator, and the x-axis represents GDP per capita. And I should specify here that GDP per capita is, we take an average of each country's GDP per capita from 1960 through to the year of the analysis, whether that's 1980 or 1990, depending on the indicator we're looking at. The dots on each panel, can you guys see my mouse? So the dots on each panel represent countries, and these are color-coded according to the group they're in. So the yellow dots are peripheral capitalist countries, the red dots are socialist countries, the blue dots are capitalist core countries, and these little gray triangles are the revolutionary states. How about if I zoom in? Can you guys see that if I zoom in? Now, for each country, you can see the curve here, which shows the modeled regression line for each group. The gray, you'll see on this panel here, there's a little slither of gray. The gray represents parts of the income range where the difference between the socialist states and the capitalist periphery is not statistically significant. So wherever you see this without gray, any part of the panel that doesn't have gray, there is a statistically significant difference between the socialist states and the capitalist periphery. So this first panel here is looking at the basic needs poverty rate. So this is the share of the population that has sufficient purchasing power to afford basic calories and housing. And what we see is that the socialist countries have considerably lower extreme poverty rates than the capitalist periphery countries at any given level of GDP. Does this make sense to people? We look at a number of indicators. So this here is life expectancy, and you see a very similar pattern where the socialist states have higher life expectancy at any given level of GDP compared to the peripheral capitalist states. Both of these indicators are for 1980. If we look here, this is the death rate from lack of access to sanitation facilities. And this data is age standardized, and this is for 1990. And yet, once again, the pattern is very clear that socialist states have markedly lower death rates from lack of access to sanitation systems. And this one here is statistically significant throughout the entire income range. And I said before that we look at 19 indicators, and the finding that we had was that for 18 of these 19 indicators, the socialist states performed better than the capitalist periphery at any given level of GDP, and that this result was statistically significant for all or most of the income range. So this here is mean years of schooling, the average years of schooling that the population can expect to have in 1980. This is access to electricity. I'm going through these one by one. This is access to electricity, and you see a similar pattern. This is in 1990. This one's really fascinating. So this is the Gini index. So it's a measure of inequality where lower scores represent higher levels of equality or lower levels of inequality. So the lower the score, the more you are up this way, the more egalitarian a country's distribution of post-tax income is. And the socialist states not only perform better than the capitalist periphery, but in fact, they also perform better than much of the core of the capitalist world system, which is quite astonishing given that the capitalist core has this imperial privilege that generally allows it to achieve stronger human welfare outcomes than the other states. This panel here is the share of parliamentary seats held by females. So this is in 1980, remember? So if you think about the situation in Western Europe and Australia, where I'm from at that time, generally has very low representation of women in parliament. But the socialist states have some of the highest levels of representation of women in their parliaments, heading up to around 25 to 30% of parliamentary seats held by women, compared to about 5% often in the capitalist periphery. You'll notice there's four core capitalist countries up here, and these are predominantly, or these are Scandinavian social democratic countries, and yet the communist countries in the periphery were performing just as well as those core social democratic states. This is the one indicator we have where the socialist states do not perform better than the capitalist periphery. So this is the Physical Integrity Rights Index, which comes from the Variety of Democracies Project. Now, the Varieties of Democracies Project, basically to sort of simplify a little bit, this is a score based on expert assessments. So historians and political scientists and independent analysts experts on certain countries are asked to rank countries from 0 to 1 based on how well a country protects physical integrity rights. And physical integrity rights is defined as freedom from government killings and torture and severe forms of political repression. And what we see is that the socialist states do not perform better than the capitalist periphery on this indicator. This is not altogether surprising because, of course, we know that many of the 20th century socialist states, the Soviet Union, Eastern European countries, China, North Korea, obviously, are well known for having overseen extreme forms of repression. What is really interesting, though, I think, is that the capitalist periphery does not perform statistically significantly better than the socialist states. So although human rights conditions were not ideal in the socialist states, it is not the case that capitalism performed better. And maybe this is something that we can come back to in the discussion. The core capitalist states do perform better, and I think we need to be aware of this core periphery divide when we look at indicators like this. Because world systems theorists point out that the pressure to export cheap resources from the periphery to core creates a condition where local elites and imperialist powers often work to undermine human rights in the periphery, using violence to force down wages, suppress labour movements, suppress trade unions, and maintain the conditions for cheap exports to the core of the world system. And this explains why we get this systematic difference between the core and periphery in terms of physical integrity rights. So I will go through sort of all the indicators here for GDP. I won't do this for material footprint and CO2 emissions. So this here is calories per person. This is the amount of calories available in an economy per day for the population. Socialist states not only perform better than the capitalist periphery across most of the income range, but in fact, past a certain point, socialist states have a higher calorie availability for their population than even the capitalist core does.
Dylan.
Yeah.
Sorry, I think the idea of zooming in was really great. So if you keep on doing this on this slide, it will be really
okay. Thank you. So I'll go to
for everyone.
Go to the calories per person. So you can see that. I mean, so this, if you look at this section here, we're mostly looking at the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. And so you can see that the Eastern European socialist states have, they rival or surpass the imperialist core powers when it comes to the amount of food they're producing for their population. This is the death rate from malnutrition, which again is age standardized. And we see that the socialist countries perform much better than the periphery. I mean, it's actually quite astonishing to think about. So you have sort of Mongolia and China up here with very low incomes in 1990, and yet they are outperforming countries with much higher income over here. So here we have the child mortality rate with a similar pattern, the infant mortality rate. The difference there is child mortality rate is the deaths of children under the age of 5, where the infant mortality rate is the deaths of children under the age of 1. In both cases, socialist countries perform very well at any given level of GDP. This is the number of doctors, medical doctors available in a population versus 1,000 people. As with food, we see that the middle income socialist states are outperforming the capitalist core. So despite the capitalist core's imperial advantage, they didn't perform as well as the Eastern European countries at ensuring that doctors were available for the population. And the same applies for hospital beds. So the socialist countries had a large number of hospital beds per 1,000 people in the population, meaning that there was somewhere, when you're sick, there's somewhere to lay and get the health and rest you need, which is an important factor. This is the adult literacy rate. I'll keep zooming in. This is in 1980, the adult literacy rate. I mean, it's fascinating, some of these countries like Mongolia here with a very low level of GDP, yet far, far higher level of literacy than even much wealthier countries. This is social services quality. This is also from VDEM. I mentioned the Varieties of Democracy project before, where experts rank between 0 and 1 how well a country does on something. So this is based on they have this, what they call an equal resources distribution index. And it shows, basically it shows the extent to which high quality social services are available to the population in an equitable way. And the experts are explicitly asked whether the quality of these social services are sufficient to allow for democratic participation from the population. And what we see, once again, is socialist states having much higher levels of social service quality than peripheral capitalist states. This is the share of the labour force that is female. So we see that in socialist states, women's access to paid employment is much higher than it is in peripheral capitalist states. This is in the year 1990. And this is one of my favourite ones. This is the share of labour income going to women. So this is the female labour income share, and this data is for 1991. So in socialist states, including those with very low income, women earn about 40% of the total labour income of the economy. And this happens because in socialist states, you have much more narrow pay scales, including between genders, and because females' access to paid employment tends to be superior. In fact, these figures here of like 40%, for perspective here, this is higher than what the Western European countries and the core has achieved even today. So we're seeing here in 1990, very low-income socialist countries like China and Vietnam and Mongolia achieving levels of gender parity that the West still hasn't been able to rival. And this here is the adolescent fertility rate, which is the total number of births of children by women aged 15 to 19 as a percentage of the total population of women aged 15 to 19. You can kind of think of it as a teen birth rate. And we see a pattern which by now you're all expecting, which is the socialist states doing better at any given level of income. So that's the result of the analysis with GDP. So we do this second analysis with material footprint. I've hit 25 minutes here, but I'm going to go for another 5 or 10 minutes. Is that all right, Sergey? So this is material footprint. I'm not going to take you through all of the panels now because you would all be so used to the pattern that we expect to see. But just to give you a bit of an explanation of what's going on here. So everything's the same as it was in the other analysis, except that on the x-axis now, we are not looking at GDP per capita, but we're looking at material footprint. Material footprint refers to the total quantity of material stuff in tonnes consumed by an economy in a given year. And we take an average from 1970 up to the year of the analysis, be that 1980 or 1990, to get a sense of the extent to which to get a sense of the extent of material consumption in different economies. Other than the fact that we're looking at material footprint, everything else is the same. The dots are countries, color-coded. The lines are the regression lines. This black line that you can see here on each of the panels, this represents this is, sorry, that's my 25 minutes being up, but I'm going to go for another 5 or 10. This black line here represents I think it's 9.45 tons of material stuff, which earth scientists tell us is the maximum sustainable level of per capita resource use given the population in 1990. Does that make sense? You get a bit of a... So it's this line here represents basically your planetary boundary for consumption of material resources, given the population in 1990. And one of the really interesting things that we see is that the capitalist core countries all have incomes above that threshold. Sorry, not incomes, material consumption. They all have material consumption that falls outside of the maximum sustainable level of resource use. So I'll zoom in on let's say life expectancy. You can see here that the core states are all consuming excess resource use. They all have levels of consumption above the maximum sustainable level. The periphery and the socialist states get much closer to the sustainable level of resource use. So I think that, actually, if I look at my notes, so the core, 70% of the core countries have more than double the maximum sustainable level of resource use. For the periphery, that is 11 to 12%, depending on the year of the analysis, whether it's 1980 or 1990. And the socialist countries have 0 to 8%, again, depending on the year of analysis. So the core capitalist states are much more environmentally unsustainable than either the socialist states or the periphery. Yeah, while the periphery has very low social outcomes in general, has very poor social outcomes, the socialist states are achieving social outcomes that are comparable to the capitalist core in many cases. Again, the one exception to this, so in 18 of the 19 indicators, the socialist states perform better. The one exception is the Physical Integrity Rights Index, which is protection from state violence. We also look at, so this here is our third analysis. So now on the x-axis, we have CO2 emissions. The line here is the maximum sustainable level of CO2 emissions per capita. And CO2 emissions, we now get a bit of a different pattern. While the socialist states still perform better than the capitalist periphery in general, this result is no longer statistically significant on most indicators. So from memory, I think it's... I think we now only have 9 indicators where the socialist advantage over the capitalist periphery is statistically significant. And the reason for this is that although socialist countries performed very well at any given level of GDP, they also had high levels of CO2 emission at any given level of GDP. And so the question then is, why is this? Why is it that socialist countries in the 20th century had such carbon-intensive economies? And very briefly, we argue in the paper that there's 2 reasons for this. One is that the socialist states of the 20th century followed a resource-intensive development model of rapidly building up heavy industry without making any attempt to minimize costs. So the socialist development model involved mobilizing resources towards production in an effort to rapidly build up carbon-intensive heavy industrial production. So if you look at the share of heavy industry in total economic activity, it was always much higher in the socialist states than it was in the capitalist states. I'm kind of being critical of this development model because of the CO2 things, but it worked well in some contexts at mobilizing resources for economic development in conditions of very severe underdevelopment. We might be able to talk about this in the discussion when we turn to questions. The second reason I think that we see high levels of CO2 emissions in the socialist states has to do with their focus on building up their military power and their armaments. So if we look at the share of military expenditure in GDP, I'll just give you some figures here. So in peripheral capitalist countries, in Mexico, for instance, a capitalist periphery country, the government spent 0.3% of GDP on the military. In Brazil, that was 0.4%. In India, that was 3.3%. Compare this to the socialist countries. In China, 21% of GDP. In Mongolia, 18% of GDP. In Bulgaria, 10% of GDP. And I hypothesized that this focus on armaments was leading to very high levels of CO2 emissions because military production is so carbon intensive. Okay, so what can we conclude from all this? And I've gone a bit over time, so I'll try to be very brief here. First, I think we see some strong evidence here, particularly from the data on GDP per capita and material footprint. I think we see some strong evidence that socialist policy can be really effective at improving human well-being and guaranteeing good social outcomes at low and modest levels of aggregate production. Even countries with very low levels of GDP and very low levels of material consumption were achieving extreme poverty rates of around 5 to 0%. They were achieving virtually no deaths from malnutrition and poor sanitation. They were achieving life expectancy in the late 60s. This is something that we can learn from about how to achieve strong human welfare outcomes at low and modest levels of aggregate production. However, this story also comes, I think, with warnings about what doesn't work, because we've seen that socialist policy, despite its achievements, can be undermined if governments pursue these policies undemocratically. So we saw, for instance, that socialist states failed to outperform capitalist states in terms of protecting human rights. And there are really important lessons that we need to learn from that about the need to respect democratic rights and have democratic accountability in any society. And also there are important lessons about not building up, not focusing production on heavy industrial output, and especially armaments and other forms of industrial production that drive up CO2 emissions without contributing to human welfare. And so apologies for going over time. I am going to leave it there.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Lea as well. And I suggest that we just voice our questions here, and then if somebody finds it easier to write in the chat, then write them in the chat, and I can voice them myself. So the floor is open to the questions, please. Yours.
In the chat.
Hello, both. Thank you very much for the presentation of the paper. It's excellent work, and it's very important research and very well thought and executed. I have a practical question. Why are you doing only these graphs and you're not doing also some ranks in terms of well-being indicators per unit of GDP and who comes first, who comes second? Because your abstract was reading a little bit like that. So you're doing these curves, but you could have a rank, like, okay, which is the highest performing country in terms of life expectancy per unit of GDP or per unit of material footprint, and see where they stand. Why I'm saying that? Because I still would like to see some comparison with the capitalist core, and how do they perform per unit of GDP, which I don't think your visual allows to do it. And why am I saying that? Because, okay, I can see your choice to compare with the others, but I'm not fully convinced. And I don't think everyone will be fully convinced, because there are countries indeed that could be considered periphery or semi-periphery. So it makes sense to compare Bulgaria and Romania with Greece and Turkey, okay. But Latvia, Estonia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, to put them semi-periphery and not compare them to East Germany. Why not compare to West Germany? That was a standard comparison throughout these years now. So I'm not fully convinced that it's correct to compare them only to the capitalist periphery. So another visual to see also how they compare with the capitalist core, or to be able to see, like, okay, how does East Germany and West Germany compare, like, would give a little bit more differentiated information. Thanks.
I think I can take this one. So just to clarify, the figures that you saw now in the presentation are just a selection. So they are the main figures, but we also, they are based on regression models that, of course, also include a comparison of the capitalist core. Why we didn't discuss this so much in the main part of the paper. Can you hear me? I think my internet connection is unstable.
It's unstable,
Okay,
but
I will
you're
just
cutting out a
okay.
bit, but we in general hear you.
Okay. Okay, I will just try and then you can let me know how much you got. In the main figure, we didn't go for that comparison also because the overlap in terms of GDP, material footprint, and CO2 emissions of these two categories, so socialist countries and capitalist core, is pretty small. So the reliability of the curves can be a bit questioned. But still, like in the supplementary information of the paper, we also show how the difference between the capitalist core and the socialist countries is. But in most cases, the differences either are not significant or the capitalist core perform better, except for instance, this female parliament seats. But this is also part of the analysis. And when you were talking about rankings, so I mean, the regression model in a way, this is like a more is a better approach than doing rankings, right? So you saw the curves. Of course, this is the illustration of the regression models, but the regression analysis itself, is a more robust approach to comparing different categories than just looking at rankings and then like asking your gut feeling whether you have the impression that here the socialist countries are better or the capitalist countries are better.
Could you explain that a little bit, sorry, because I didn't understand. So I was thinking, how can you get from this graph the impression of who is more efficient per unit of GDP, for example? Because they seem to have comparable human development levels, for example, but then one GDP is much higher. So then I imagine that maybe the socialist countries are more efficient per unit of GDP, even from the capitalist core, right? But I can't see it in this graph and get this sense whether it's true or not.
I mean, so in the graph, you can see it just from how the curve goes. So the more the curve is in the upper left corner, so in the corner of low resource use but high development outcome, the more efficient the country is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes, but then they're probably even more efficient than the capitalist core, rather, because they were always to the left, the socialists, or not?
Can you repeat that?
Taking the space. They were always on the left side, the socialists of the capitalist core, so they're even more efficient than the capitalist core, not only the ones who were below them. But you were focusing that they're better than the ones below, so you're saying they're even better than the ones to the right.
Yeah, well, I think in a way that depends a bit on where you take what you would say would be a minimal level of, for instance, development that you want to achieve, right? Because it's just like it's an optimization with two different categories at the same time. Yeah.
If I can jump in with a few thoughts, I like the idea actually of looking.
Dylan, do you think we could maybe proceed to other questions because we only have 13 minutes?
Yeah, let's do it.
I think we should space it out a bit more evenly. Lausanne, there's a question at Lausanne, please.
Can you hear me from here? Yeah. For a start, that was really, really good, really interesting. Thanks. My main question is do your results have implications for the kind of Bill Gates, world in data, big narratives about look how much better the world's gotten in the last 50 years or so? Can you basically say, well, look how much of that was something to do with capitalism and was in these socialist states? Are you able to do that kind of decomposition from this work? And it's not really a second question, just a clarification. Was it carbon footprint or territorial emissions that you were?
So on that second question, yes, it's consumption-based emissions. So we are taking into account trade flows of CO2. On the first question about what's the implications for the Bill Gates, our world in data sort of narrative, we don't talk about that in the paper, but I think I think you can conclude what you want from the results. Yeah, I think to give sort of my view, and I'm not sure this isn't something we discuss in the paper as well, but I think it's clear that much of the improvement in human welfare has come from socialist policies and from the implementation of public provisioning, revolutionary and radical public provisioning political projects. And I mean, I have a paper on this, or a couple of paper on this, if you're interested. So with Jason Hickel, I have a paper on capitalism and extreme poverty in world development, where we tackle this question of the sort of Bill Gates narrative of progress. And we're more explicit in that about rejecting that narrative, but we don't focus on it so much in this paper.
Charles?
There's another question in the room, but Charles can go first.
No, go ahead, Lizanne.
Okay, great talk and great work, Dylan and Lea. My question was that while I am convinced with the final thesis qualitatively that socialist states do better than the capitalist periphery on a lot of these indicators, my concern is about whether, one, we're able to quantify appropriately by how much, even on average, and two, about whether we're able to draw conclusions accurately in terms of numbers about what part of this is because of socialism. And I ask this question because what if we compared the USSR, Yugoslavia, China, Vietnam to DRC, Afghanistan, Peru in 1917 or 1939? And would we see the countries at the exact same level? It's unlikely. And even if then I assume that this countries, the socialist form of government did improve these indicators differentially, we're not going to be able to measure it because a part of it from this scope might be due to pre-existing inequalities. And so if you had a sort of first difference analysis or a comparison of countries that had similar starting points, that would seriously strengthen the statistical analysis and strengthen the claims that we're able to make from this.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we do have there are comparisons like that can be made. I mean, there's a good book by Amartya Sen and Jean Dreze called Hunger and Public Action, 1989 book, which compares India and China and says, in 1949, India and China had remarkably similar levels of life expectancy, mortality rates, access to food. And they look at the data, and China zooms ahead of India throughout the 1950s and 1960s and early 1970s. And they attribute this to China's public provisioning programs for food and healthcare. There's other comparisons that can be made. I mean, if you were to compare, say, the Soviet Union with Mexico and Brazil, for instance, in the 1920s, Latin America and the Soviet Union have very similar levels of life expectancy, and they depart quite radically over the following decades, especially in the 1950s. And it seems clear to me that the reason for that is the kind of public provisioning systems that were being rolled out in the USSR but weren't being rolled out in Latin America. But yeah, of course, doing that kind of analysis definitely could strengthen the paper.
Yeah, I think it's also important to see that here we really tried to have a large number of social indicators for which data only became available in the 1980s or in the 90s, even in some cases. And I think it is true that, first of all, this is just correlation, right? We haven't proved causation with that necessarily. So it has to be accompanied by additional historical analysis that really looks at trends. However, such a extensive analysis as we did would not be possible with trends over time because the data is not available for so many indicators. So yeah, it really needs to be seen as a piece of puzzle and not as the one perfect proof.
Thank you.
Should I go? Thank you both. Terribly exciting research. My question regards how we define socialist policy, and I don't think you had time to get into this in your presentation, but in the abstract you sent around, you include a list with elements like public spending, and it's more of an open question. I don't think any of us have a perfect answer here, but a lot of the policies that you include in the list are also being enacted in various ways in the core or in the capitalist periphery. And I just think this is something that is particularly relevant now as we evaluate current socialist projects. So I just any thoughts you might have on what actually is socialist policy?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think there's lots of interesting things to be done about comparing within the capitalist group differences between neoliberal states and states that pursued more social democratic or developmentalist policies. There's lots of really important research to be done there. Of course, we didn't do that here. Our scope, if you want, was more restricted, where we were just looking at this difference between the socialist and capitalist states, and we were assuming, and I think it's a fair assumption, that looking at the difference between those states tells us something about the difference between, public provisioning type policies and the absence of them. But yeah, looking at within the capitalist group would be interesting too, and also looking within the socialist group, because there's quite a lot of variation within that group as well. They're not uniform by any means. One thing, in terms of the broader question of how do we define socialist policy, in a sense, we don't do that in this paper, because in this paper, I think actually what we want to do is study, like, we're using socialism in a really historically specific sense to refer to the Marxist-Leninist regimes of the 20th century, right? Now, a lot of people would argue that these states weren't really socialist, and I've actually made that argument myself a lot of times in my life. I nevertheless think it's useful to analyze them, and we have to call them something, so call them socialist.
Oscar.
Thank you both for a very interesting presentation. Obviously, it's an excellent paper. It's very punchy, and depending on where you publish it, you might get stir a lot of controversy, which I'm sure you're also hoping for, of course. My question is one of, given that policies in, let's say, Denmark and England are very, very different, like, yes, they are both capitalist countries, but they are still very different, also with very different outcomes. And also, as we've discussed, the difference between Afghanistan and China, it's hard to put them together and say it's socialist. Wouldn't it help your paper just to pull back a little bit, make the descriptive analysis, and then not make the claims that, just let it hang, that let it be implicit, the claim that this proves something for the way forward? I'm just saying, I think you have a very punchy paper without trying to make that claim, which you can see everybody in the room now, all the questions we've had are questioning. Was that, I know it was slightly unclear, but can you nod if it?
Which kind of claim would you propose to take back, Oscar?
Just thank you, Sergey. The conclusions you presented at the end, like that socialist policies show us a way forward. I mean, I think you're making that without saying that. And nobody, I think it's hard to attack your graphs and all everything you show. And there's plenty of contribution in that already. So my question is just, do you really need to make the claim that this is something we can, I can't remember the exact formulation, the conclusion, but I think your paper just stands very clear and on its own, and it becomes more defendable if you don't make the claim that this is something we can use to look into the future. Did that help? No?
Yeah, it's something to think about. I'll take it as a comment, perhaps, more than probably not something I need to, but yeah, it's a good point. Thank you, Oscar.
yeah, so maybe I could go. Indeed, bringing again back to the conclusions, I wonder what was the thing that you learned that in your mind clicked after doing this research, because it seems that, we in general know that the historical socialism of 20th century did a lot of public provisioning, that it put first, it prioritized literacy, health, education, etc., gender equality, and I wonder, so to speak. At the same time, we know that they had to arm so much and were dragged into an arms race that was not of their own choosing. In that sense, we can't just say, oh, next time we can do without arms. No, you can't. And so, therefore, and also, so I wonder what was for you the pattern that really that really at least helped you or understand something new or understand something old in a new way. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I take your sort of point of like we already knew this, that the socialist states prioritized health and education, but I suppose it's still striking to see it reflected in the empirical data. I think it's still striking how clear the patterns are in my view. And of course, we all, I don't know, maybe not all of us, but certainly I grew up being exposed to a lot of anti-communist propaganda. And so there is still a part of me that is surprised when I see these results. Because I grew up learning that the socialist states didn't perform better than the capitalist states, and that actually the complete opposite was true. And so for me, coming across this history and learning more about the fact that it actually did work or wasn't a total failure, that there was something there, that for me is still exciting. And it's exciting to be able to reclaim some of that history, that it wasn't, that socialism wasn't all just gulags and repression, there was something else there.
Yeah, it's funny because I actually wanted to say a very similar thing, that coming from Germany, where the dominant narrative is that socialism was a complete failure in every regard, I think this is still interesting results to have it like in color, in lines. Although, of course, also coming from Germany, I also know about the very problematic, undemocratic aspects. Yeah, so I would double you on that, Dylan.
If I can say one thing about armaments, because I think that this is something that we need to think more maybe not more carefully, but there needs more thought, because it seems to me there's a few things going on that cause this situation of massive armaments production in the socialist countries. So one is what you just alluded to, Sergey, that they are all blockaded, invaded, surrounded, and they have to build up arms to defend themselves. It seems to me that there's something else going on, though, whereas there develops in the 20th century socialist states a kind of military industrial elite class whose institutional power is actually linked to the size of heavy industry and the size of armaments production. And this class, in a sense, I think, and this is a hypothesis, I don't want to sort of claim to have answers here, it's something to think about, but I think that this class essentially becomes complicit in the arms race, that actually the imperialists and the sort of military industrial planning class, they kind of embrace they embrace one another in this dance of death, so to speak, where they're both building up arms in their own interests and in the interests of their own institutional power. And that kind of, I think there's a dynamic that goes further than just this being forced on them. And if I could say one other thing, there is actually a really interesting example of a socialist state which has demilitarized, and that is Cuba. After 1990, Cuba's armaments spending, I don't have the exact figures on me, but I mean, it declines from like hundreds of billions to like millions of dollars spent on armaments. And as they downscale the size of the military, their armaments production, you see something which is not seen in many other countries, which is an improvement in health at the same time as material resource use and CO2 emissions decline. And so I think there's something really interesting to learn from Cuba in the 1990s when the armaments industry is degrown, so to speak.
Let's take a thank you for your answers. Let's take maybe a question from Lausanne and then we can close. How about that?
So, okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm following up on these questions or comments about the interpretation of the results. I really like the regression approach because it allows you to group meaningfully the countries, no? But I don't know if you thought about doing the opposite thing, to group, instead of to group ex ante, to group ex post with a cluster analysis, for example, to let the data speak, which I think was a bit the idea of some of Oscar who mentioned talked before, no? To do cluster analysis. I don't know if you thought about.
So you mean clustering the countries by performance and then checking in which cluster we find which kind of regime type?
Something like that.
Yeah, well, I think this can be like also a nice visualization of the points we want to make. I would still say that in terms of yeah, the option to really use statistical tests and get statements on significance and so on, a regression analysis is basically doing the same, but in a more robust way, like doing clusters and then checking the share of socialist countries in each cluster is, yeah, I would say pretty much the same as doing the regression analysis and then seeing whether there are statistically significant effects, except that we have like a more robust method.
We'll talk later.
So I would suggest that we close at that. Let's maybe applaud Dylan and Leah for the great research and presentation and stimulating discussion, and applaud all of us. And I have posted in the chat the link and announcement about the next public lecture organized by our project by Morena. She will speak on March 27th about economics of liberation, delinking from unequal exchange in the world economy. Everyone is welcome. Oh my God, it's not March, of course. It's Tuesday, 27th of May. It's martes, and it's at 3 p.m. The link is here, and I'm sure you'll see other announcements. So thank you, everyone, and let's close here.
Thanks, everyone.